Okay, so I think just about everybody is joined. We still have one or two more. So those who have just joined, thank you for joining today's webinar. This webinar, we're going to cover conducting an internal SAP licensing review and how you can take control of your SAP licensing in 2021. Very happy, delighted to be joined by Hans Merkens of Fisher ITS, who will be helping me present today, and will be imparting upon you our joint knowledge of conducting SAP licensing reviews to give you the basics and fundamentals and building blocks you need to carry out one yourselves and hopefully get on top of SAP licensing. So over to you, Hans. Obviously, you can introduce yourself to the audience if you like.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Hans. I think we'll get a quick introduction over the company later on as well. So I think we can dig a bit more in it, but hopefully we can be of some help. Personally got some auditor experience, so hopefully that'll come across well. Back to you, Jan.
So Hans, you've got mouse control or screen control if you need that. There you go.
I think that works well. Jan, I think
okay.
Started.
So just a few things before we get started properly. We have a couple of polls to kind of sense check a few different aspects of people's needs and interests regarding the webinar and the topic. So before we start the actual webinar presentation, we're going to go through two polls. Also, if you want to ask questions, you should have access to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, maybe on the left. But you can use that to ask any questions you like. And we will try and monitor those as they come in throughout the session. But if your question isn't answered during the webinar, we'll make time for a proper Q&A session at the end as well. So looking to wrap things up around 22 quarter to the hour and have plenty of time to ask anyone's questions regarding the topic. So a little introduction about myself and VOQUZ Labs. My name is Jan Cook. I'm advisory director for the UK and also senior licensing advisor for VOQUZ Labs global licensing advisory practice. VOQUZ Labs, we specialize in SAP licensing and security. We have two main tools, SAMQ and SecQ, which are our software asset management and security authorization management tools, respectively. We launched in 1980, and today we've grown to have global offices, 400 clients globally, 300 employees, and we obviously take part in hundreds of SAP projects per year. And we have, obviously a good level of expertise around the topic. Handing over to Hans and Fisher.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm part of Fisher ITS, senior manager in the team, and leading several licensing experts. So we are not focused on SAP, but obviously as one of the biggest vendors out there, it takes a big chunk of the work. We do 360 items, so we look at all vendors, all different things. We provide advisory, contract advisory, and any kind of governance services as well. So overall, any questions there? Also quite a big footprint on the market, I think, that we've gathered over the years, and with a global presence as well. So I think that's a brief introduction. If there's any questions on us, feel free to reach out, of course.
Okay, and just a quick acknowledgement to everyone who's attended any of our past events. We did recently do a digital access webinar earlier in January, and it was a roaring success. It was our most successful event so far, with 965 registrants, almost 500 attendees from 52 different countries. And in fact, today's webinar has well over 1,000 registrations for this event as well. So thanks to everyone who's been following our events and joining our webinars, and for joining today's session as well. So as mentioned, the topic today, conducting an internal SAP licensing review. So we're going to take you through the key steps and processes and things you need to take consider of when reviewing your SAP licensing position. First thing is to discuss the drivers for conducting an internal licensing review. And in today's economic climate, and with regards to things like digital transformation and migration to new technology platforms, we believe there are 4 key drivers for performing an internal licensing review this year. First of all, cost saving. So if you're overspending on IT, or you need to shore up IT budgets, or you're over licensed on SAP and paying too much, this would be a good driver, a good reason to conduct an internal licensing review to see if you can identify any cost saving opportunities. Obviously, when the economic climate is the way it is, vendors look to shore up their own revenues by identifying unlicensed use of their software, or so far unearned revenue, which is what they call it. And most of them, including SAP, have very tight, well-established audit practices, and you would see a higher than normal audit activity in conditions as we have had recently. Following on from the last webinar we did about digital access, the DAAP incentive program that runs until the end of this year. So you do have commercial incentives and different licensing models to take advantage of with regards to digital access and document-based licensing for indirect use. So again, if you're going to start up a project, do the analysis, understand your risk position, look at the mitigations, and weigh up the respective models available to you, then if you're going to do that in advance of 2021 and the DAAP deadline, then again, that's another strong driver to be performing an internal licensing review. And the last one being S4 HANA migration. The latest SAP statistics suggest that only 15% of SAP's global ERP customer base are currently licensed for S4 HANA. And with the deadline approaching in 7 years, many customers want to get ahead of the curve and maybe considering their migration this year. So we'll be talking a little bit about how you can use the outputs of a licensing review to inform the negotiation of your S4 HANA agreements. And quickly then to the polls. So the first poll we have is, how regularly do you conduct an internal license audit for SAP within your organization? So we'll launch that poll, and the poll is now open. And we have responses, of course, are starting to flood in.
I think the majority actually is saying it regularly, or at least occasionally, so that seems good.
So we'll just wait until the vote's just over 50% and still plenty of votes coming in. So we'll give it a moment more. If you haven't voted, go ahead and vote. Let us know what you think. How frequently does your organization conduct internal license audits for SAP? Okay, so I think we've got a good representation of the vote. Responses collected. Sebastian, how do I share the result?
I think we can close the poll and then share. That seems to work. There we go.
Closed poll, there you go.
Yeah.
So there you go, poll results. So you can actually see almost a third of everyone watching perform an internal license audit every single year. So for those who responded in that way, obviously be mindful, what we're doing is distinguishing between doing an internally driven review of SAP licensing that's independent of the vendor and not simply taking part in the annual license audit process. So again, what we will help you understand is what is the difference of taking part in the vendor-driven process and actually doing your own review. So what can you do to perform a thorough and in-depth analysis? So 10% not doing an internal audit regularly, 23% occasionally, so that's 1/4 almost occasionally whenever it's necessary, and 1 in 10 performing an internal license audit more than once a year. So that could be quarterly or annually, by regularly keeping up to date with usage and licensing levels and licensing conditions, and 20% not sure. So again, that's obviously a reason to take a look at what the business drivers are and perhaps understand if it would be advantageous.
What we would usually say for a bigger organization for sure is that at least twice a year is usually recommended. Once just to prepare for the annual SAP audit, once just so in the middle you got a checkpoint and see whether or not you can improve, make any decisions later on in the year and prepare for that perfectly. But obviously there is no right and wrong, but there is a bit more risk with not doing that.
Exactly. So that was very interesting. Sebastian, can you help share the next poll? Okay, so we go on to the next poll and launch. So that is, if you were to perform a license, an internal review of SAP licensing this year, what would be your primary driver? Would it be identifying licensing risks to get audit ready and compliant, identifying cost-saving opportunities, address digital access risk, or to underpin your preparations for an S4 HANA licensing negotiation? And it's great to get this feedback before we start the presentation, because we can focus on different elements of how this kind of work can in fact satisfy those particular business needs. So interestingly enough, yep, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, it seems that we're making good progress. 40% voted, and you were probably going to say it seems that risk is the biggest driver, which makes sense because that's probably what most people do an audit for, or internal review.
And interestingly, coming off the back of our last webinar, only 4% so far would do an internal review in order to tackle digital access risk. That I'd like to know if that's because they don't see that as part of this kind of work, or because they in fact don't envisage themselves to be at risk, and maybe there's not the need. So again,
usually seen as a separate process, I guess, so that might explain it.
Yeah.
Let's share these results too. Yeah, go ahead.
Sharing poll results. So there you have it. So again, 1/4 looking to identify cost-saving opportunities. If you did a piece of work like this and you actually identified that your licensing was well in excess of what you were actually using, I wonder if that would change those drivers, and perhaps you might start to realize that you could save money. So that might be reflective of customers not currently being aware of their true usage. 55%, half concerned about compliance and audit risk. So we've got some good content around that and how you can manage complex and challenging license metrics in your contracts. We will touch on digital access a little bit, because it is something that you can incorporate into your review, and we'll talk through the steps that you should follow to do that. And again, 15% would be underpinning their preparations for S4 HANA migration. So I guess that's, thank you for participating. That's been insightful and slightly different results to what I was expecting, but great to see the feedback, and hopefully we can take account of that, Hans, when we are presenting the rest of the slides.
I think in the end, an internal review should focus definitely on the first 3 points. The fourth obviously depends on whether or not you're actually in that process.
Very true. Okay, so how to perform an internal audit. So first of all, so the 3 key stages. First of all, you establish your licensing entitlements, and that's important because SAP buying and purchasing is complicated. many customers have had SAP for a long time and may have accrued a complex purchasing history, including purchasing different products. You might have gone through product name changes, metric changes, material number changes, new product launches, returns, exchanges, credits, terminations, and all sorts of things that might affect what you're actually licensed for today. So benchmarking that and getting a handle on that is obviously very important. Establish actual usage. So what we'll do is we will explain the difference between simply extracting basic usage data.
I don't think we're sharing the slides right now. I don't know if we were.
That is handy. So there's the slide that I'm currently trying to talk about. Number one, establish your entitlements. Number two, establish actual usage. And then number three, consolidate results, draw conclusions, and then inform business strategy thereafter.
So the first one that we're going to touch quickly on is your contract. And now this is something that is very difficult for many people, especially because for SAP contracts, because it's so complex and because SAP has these long histories of piles of PDFs that just keep stacking on your machines, on your databases, wherever you store them. So first of all, very briefly, because I assume most people are at least got a basic understanding of SAP licensing. So how is it licensed? Most systems is a package plus a user. You almost always need both. There's a few exceptions, one being digital access and certain cloud models. But always keep in mind that when you're reviewing your SAP contract, to keep both, I would even recommend separate, just so you've got a clear overview of what is what, and make sure that every system has both types of licenses to cover it, except if you know it shouldn't. So let's move on to the next slide. So very briefly, digital access, as I already mentioned, the one big exception. Legacy, it was always all users need a license for all access. With all the backlash to the lawsuits, everything that came through, where people were saying, what are we supposed to do with these kind of situations? SAP has introduced the digital access model, where they say you don't always need a user license if you cover one of these specific scenarios where you are covering, but usually external users and so onward, that indirectly through another application access your SAP environment. You can license it by a document, which is similar to your package licenses. Let's carry on to the next slide. So, except the focus is not necessarily on taking in all individual types of license. There's hundreds. If you try to figure out what is in your contract, what is going on. So keep in mind that you're always going to find two different contracts. One is you're going to have your perpetual on-premise. You could only have one of these, of course, and the other end you've got your cloud services licenses, which are subscription-based. The on-premise is traditionally the very big 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 different PDF documents, making it up into one long list of small changes. The cloud being the new contracts we agree to, which would just have a subscription that expire in a year or a few years, or can have some other wording around that. Keep in mind that beyond this, that in this, well, I'll put it like in this slide, we're going to focus on your ERP contracts, so your main ERP systems. But beyond this, you might have some legacy agreements as well. For example, business objects never been properly integrated, completely separate way of auditing, of reviewing that. And then your hybrids or other tools that are, for example, cloud tools, that would also still be a bit separate. But when it comes down to it broadly, the process of how do you review this will still be similar, but there will be peculiarities here and there. So specifically on the on-premise, in the next slide. So the on-premise agreement, what you're going to find, as already mentioned, is going to find one very large agreement. So this is almost always the case. Every document will be linked, even if it's 100 separate documents, they will all be linked. So you should get everything together. And we can't specify this enough for, or go on this enough for SAP. When you're looking at an SAP contract or SAP license review, you need to know your contract inside and outside. and compared to some other vendors, SAP is almost 100% contract driven. So whatever is online, you cannot rely on. If it's not in your contract, it is not valid for you. It can be helpful, it can be indicators. So specifically, for example, if you look at the first document you always sign, your base agreement, general terms and conditions, there will already be some important definitions in there. For example, what is a named user for you will be in this contract, in these general terms and conditions. And this is usually going to be a document that you signed at the very beginning, which could be 20 years ago or even more than that. So that definition of 20 years ago will still be valid. So digging that up is definitely useful to figure out for your organization, is there specific restrictions, other things, add that on there. You could reference the online terms as well, just in case, because just to see what it is, or if you can't find it, at least then you've got an identifier what's going on. On top of the base agreement, you're going to have a lot of order forms, exhibit, appendices. I've seen different names throughout different countries, different areas, just different years. And it will normally be numbered, so you can figure out if you're missing any agreement number or anything. I would definitely recommend ask SAP about this. They normally will provide this as a service. Make sure you've got every single one of these order forms. Even if you don't believe anything is in there anymore, if it's been terminated, there might still be some wording, maybe a definition that is not in any later document. So it's always good to just pull everything up. So the first step of any license audit, license review is digging up that full contract and seeing it. So that on the other end, you're going to have the cloud agreement, similar principle. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, so similar principle. It's a subscription base, though, but still, we would recommend dig everything up. Here, you could leave out a few of the original if all the subscriptions are expired. However, again, there might still be some wording. You will find order forms, the general terms and conditions again. You might have a data processing agreement and service level agreements. But in the end, the basic setup is the same. You're going to have your standard agreements, your general terms and conditions, processing, service level, and then on top, you're going to have that there's order forms every time you buy new software. There's going to be two models. Either you're going to have subscription-based, or you might have, in some cases, consumption-based, but this is limited to some products, platforms, and not to every region. Now, in the next slide, what do you do when you have all of these documents? And the main thing we always recommend is try to map everything down. Nobody can remember whatever is in contract number 25 out of 100. You're going to forget. There's no point in doing that. So collect everything that's available, organize them so you have them chronological order or based on the numbers, so you have some way to go through this, reference back to them. Request any missing documents from SAP. That will provide this normally. This doesn't really raise suspicion. It's a normal request. Find all the important clauses, and then at the end, get a very big spreadsheet and make a full overview of the evolution. How did your licenses change? When did you buy licenses? When did anything go different? And what you will get in the next slide should be an overview like this. So this is what we would always do as well when we start an audit. This is what SAP does as well when they do audits and they don't have it in their systems. They make this full overview, which will have chronologically, all right, this is what we bought, what we removed, terminated in every single agreement. So step one, get this contract inventory, this base overview of everything you own. So let's carry on to the usage report. Back to you, Jan.
Thank you. So when we talk about identifying actual usage, we have to consider what tools and processes are available to us. So SAP has its own measurement program, LAW. If you're going to use the proprietary measurement tooling or the measurement program, you have to be aware of what it can do and what it cannot do, with respect to how you then can analyze the data and manage the configuration of your systems off the back of that data. For example, if you're using LAW, you can't perform active user account right sizing That's because LAW simply reports on the number of active user accounts that you have configured. Whereas if you were using a SAM tool like SAMQ, for example, the software will identify via different usage parameter whether a user account is in use or not, and you can drill down to each individual user account to analyze whether that needs to be locked and expired. SAMQ will identify if you have locked an account but have not set the expiry settings correctly. If you don't set, for example, an expiry date that is in the past, then that account, whether locked or not, for example, will still remain active and would be counted by the measurement program. So, very, nuances like that you need to be aware of. A SAM tool can optimize your classification of named users, whereas LAW simply reports on how you have classified users in the system. You can remediate user configuration issues, so things like if you have vacant classifications, LAW report that user as a professional, whereas if you use a SAMQ tool, for example, it would automatically replace that vacant classification with the correct license to make sure the user is consuming the correct license. LAW reports tend to be about 40 to 60 pages in terms of PDF, and it's quite difficult to narrow and drill down to. If you're not accustomed to reading these reports and interpreting the data, I don't know how many have experience in not talking about the measurement summary that's returned to you by SAP following an audit. I'm talking about the LAW log file that you produce and send to SAP. So yeah, you get better visualization of product consumption when you're using a tool than you do by trying to interpret the proprietary reports in SAP. LAW is not to report indirect access activity, whereas a SAM tool will. And you can use a SAM tool to quantify digital document consumption. You can model S/4HANA user types in a SAM tool as well, if that's the driver for your business. And you can automate license management processes using the tool. So, for example, if you make any changes and updates to the system, you can actually simulate an LAW report in the software rather than having to access the system and run new LAW measurement reports. So you can actually simulate LAW measurements, and each time you make any changes or updates, you can actually then refresh the data and review the impact on your licensing position that those changes have made. So, I mean, LAW can be a bit cumbersome. The data is in essence there. If you can manually, rather than using a tool, if you can manually review the classification of users, then of course, when you make those changes, LAW will reflect your optimal licensing position once you run it. So there are, you can use it, and just be mindful of what it does and doesn't do. So you could take rather than simply relying on the data you get at face value. So user licensing. So like I said, the law report doesn't, the LAW report reflects only how you have classified users, and it doesn't tell you if you've classified users correctly. And it doesn't tell you how you should have licensed users. So you would have, whether you use a SAM tool or you do a manual review of all users in all productive SAP systems, you should do that when performing your internal license audit, because you must classify users. First of all, from a client compliance perspective, they must be compliant. So they must be classified with the right user license in accordance with how they're using the software. And second of all, they have to be assigned the cheapest compliant license type so that you're not over licensing users and you are protecting your cost base. So make sure you're addressing that. When it comes to engine licensing, some products cannot be measured by LAW. So you will find when you get the LAW report that some engine usage data just simply isn't there because a product's not measurable. Some are only measured as active, but with no usage level measured. So it will tell you that the product's in use, but you will have to then go to a technician, probably a basis consultant or a security analyst, or indeed a functional manager or system owner, to try and then derive the usage level for that in-use product. Some products are measured by the wrong license metric. If we take LAW, when you install updates and enhancement packs, LAW being proprietary, there are updates made to that as well. So LAW is constantly analyzing usage according to today's price list. But if you take APO, you've had value of planned products, number of planned products, planning sites, planning locations. So if you've got customers who have bought APO on 4 different metrics, but yet APO LAW is measuring the number of planning sites that you've configured in APO solution, then for 75% of customers, it's not even measuring the right number. So the number that you return, and if you compare that to your entitlements, you will get a mismatch and potentially actually create a licensing issue by relying on that data. So you have to then qualify LAW measurements to the actual metric that you licensed. So that's obviously very important. Some products are measured according to the right metric, but are measured incorrectly. And again, APO is a great example. Logistics locations, you have to implement a support note to make sure that for example, type 10 logistics location, type 1010 isn't counted because it's not relevant for licensing purposes. But if you haven't implemented the note, it will count them and it will declare a number well in excess of what actually reflects your use of the software in accordance to that metric. So again, some license metrics are measured, but they are simply returning an incorrect usage value. Engine measurements are always according to today's price list, and that's reflected in enhancement packs and updates that you are implementing. LAW doesn't measure indirect use per se, but it does provide information on technical users which could prompt SAP to investigate further. So where LAW, it's actually LAW 2.0. LAW 1 doesn't do that, the old version, but the new version, LAW 2, most customers though are receiving instructions to update LAW 2.0 as part of their audit instructions every year. So it's 70–80% are probably using Law 2. It can give SAP some information on technical users. It won't tell SAP if there is upstream indirect usage or the extent of any unlicensed use, but certainly it can prompt SAP to investigate further. Soon enough, digital access measurement will also be part of the LAW program. So LAW will report digital document consumption, which is highly, in fact, is far more transparent and highly indicative of indirect usage. That's due to be released middle of this year, latest towards the end of the year. So customers should be mindful that with SAP's release of the new digital access licensing model, there will be a push and there will be a drive to get customers compliant and right licensed in that particular area as well. Some further points, on the user licensing side, if you're using a tool, then that's going to identify the cheapest compliant license type for all users. And it's normally a quick and easy process to update them all. And that would, if you've optimized users, then that would reflect actual usage and not the pre-optimized report that you would get from LAW, for example. So if you rely on LAW, you have to have performed either a manual or a tool-based optimization in advance to make sure you're optimizing LAW data. So again, don't simply relying on LAW data at face value. Engine licensing, some engine measurement is configured according to your contract. So for example, if you're using a tool, you can actually select the correct metrics for your products and configure that as to support software asset management, and therefore you can rely on being returned more accurate values. So if you're using an LAW, or any other manual processes, just be aware of what it can and can't do, because that will inform your preparations and how and what work you actually need to do before you even touch LAW and start trying to derive usage levels from there. So here is an example of how reviewing the classification of users can impact your licensing position. So Here we have a customer's consumption of user licenses according to LAW, and that is how they have classified users in the system. So this customer is consuming almost 5.5 million worth of licenses. And then following optimization, we've actually reduced consumption of the more expensive license types. We've also reduced the total number of active user licenses being consumed. And therefore, we've managed to reduce consumption of user licenses to 3.5 million. So that can be important if, for example, your inventory was only 4 million, then in fact, optimization has brought you back within your license level, and you've mitigated almost 1.5 million worth of licensing risk that you may otherwise have been subject to if you had declared that, or that had been discovered as a result of a license audit. And back to what Hans was talking about in terms of the contract. So whether you do it with a tool or manually, when you're doing a contract review, you have to obviously create an inventory of all the user license types that you have licensed, and you have to understand the use right definition. And the use right definition will tell you what a user can and cannot do within that user license type. So what you do is then you do a functional review in the systems, and you have a look at what they are doing, what transactions they're performed. You can look at, if you've got a good role policy, you can look at what roles they've been assigned in the system to understand potentially what they are and aren't doing, or what they can do. And by understanding that definition, you can look at any given user, and you can then say, right, they will need to change this user's classification. We're going to downgrade them from a professional to a limited, or from a professional to an employee, or indeed from an employee down to an ESS user, for example. So doing a user classification review, don't let that just become static. Make sure you identify processes to go through completely from the ground up all your user classifications, and make sure they have a compliant license type and the cheapest available compliant license type from your inventory. So what happens though if you haven't licensed some of the cheaper license types? Well, in actual fact, you do have the right to contract or license other license types from SAP's price list. So some of the other ones available to you if you're consuming a lot of expensive types would be things like logistics user, project worker, manager self-service, and employee self-service. And these are much cheaper than the most common standard license types. So again, you should be requesting from SAP a copy of today's price list, if not a list of all available user license types and the definitions. And what you need to do is analyze whether there is a better fit between these license types and your business users, and could you save money and reduce consumption by contracting these cheaper license types from the price list. SAMQ, for example, has all these license types and license definitions already customized in the tool. So at a click of a button, you can actually perform a price list simulation, and you can actually test users in all systems and find out if they correlate to any of these unlicensed user types. And if you find there's a strong correlation between users and unlicensed types, then of course that would inform some commercial steps that you need to take to buy cheaper licenses. And again, that would give you something to potentially save money on. Here is a typical package or engine licensing report from SAMQ. It's actually consolidated at the product and line item level. So again, if you're using LAW, you have more data to go through, and you may have to consolidate from different systems, and you'll have to use the LAW tool to pull all that data together, especially if you have 10, 15, 20 different productive SAP systems. There's a lot of usage data that needs to be consolidated. Again, another engine measurement report from SAMQ, and sorry, share my screen, get that out of the way. Yep, sorry about that. And then further engine measurement reporting. So perhaps, so Hans, perhaps you can help us just understand a bit more about that as well.
So yeah, as Jan already said, you're not going to find everything in these reports. This is not anything slight on SAMQ or even law. Some things are just not measurable. And often if SAP hasn't provided a good way to figure out what is going on with a specific engine, you're not going to see that. So be careful that there is always going to be these items in a report. As you can see, either that will say it's not measured or it's self-declaration, or it could even be both. In the end, there they are. So what do you do with those? Let's go to the next slide.
There we go.
So the first step in every process, same as I said, you cannot do anything in SAP without checking the contract definition. So make sure if you find an engine in your measurement, whatever method you're using, make sure that you're aware of what you should actually find or what you're hoping to find. So you could always then see, is the application in use? Because one very valid application, it might be you're not using the software. So often it's good to have a discussion with your technical teams to see, does anyone know where this is in use, where I maybe should find it, and so on. Then you could check, is there a measurement error? It's the law tool and everything built on top of it is not perfect. There will often be issues, things that are not being picked up. So double check whether your SAP has published any notes on it. They publish over 100 a year, I believe. So this measurement program is never perfect. Double check if you can't fix it and then get a good measurement. And the last X resort, if nothing else works or if it's just not possible to measure it, just check it manually, because often that's the only way forward. Now, there is obviously going to be so many different package types, engine licenses, that we can't touch in every one of them. But we've covered just a few just to give you an idea of what you might find. So if we go to the next slide. The first one where we thought we touch is, for example, annual revenue, or just revenue, as it will be in a lot of contracts. So the definition there is fairly concise: annual incomes from company, from normal business activity, and any other parts like interest, dividend, royalties, and so forth. So now this is fairly straightforward. Normally you just find your company's annual report, and this obviously SAP won't be aware of this, so the recommendation is to always do find that then and identify in that report what is your annual revenue number. End of story. This is also published for public companies, so be aware that SAP will often do this research as well and check to see if it still makes sense. Now, do be careful though with this metric if you see it in your contract, because there might still be restrictions. Even though it's so simple, there is some where it might only be one department, one subsidiary that uses the engine. So in that case, you may only need to cover that one. Opposite, obviously, it's possible that you only think it's one department subsidiary, but if it's done in your contract, this could be dangerous to see what kind of revenue should be counted. And just in general, be aware, for example, this one and many others is metrics that people forget because it's not visual. It's just something in a contract negotiated years ago. So if you have this in your contract, keep in mind, it has to be kept in line with country growth or maybe even decline. If your company gotten rid of a massive subsidiary and it's halved in size, you may be able to reduce this by half if you can renegotiate your contract. So moving on to the next one, another example of what...
worth mentioning that we are 12 minutes from the end. So we do have questions coming in. If anyone wants to ask questions, maybe ask them now. I'll keep an eye on questions coming in while Hans runs through the kind of latter part of the presentation.
Yeah, let's see what we can cover quickly. So then go to the next slide. We've got the course metric. So this has changed from the overview. So you can already see this is going to be a lot longer than that revenue one and might have some more implications depending on your environment. So the straightforward for that one, for example, is identify the hardware details, check with the technical teams if necessary, and then carefully read the definition to make sure you got the correct number. Now, this course one is a bit more straightforward. We're not going to dig into it too much, but specifically for CPU, which was the predecessor, this was a lot more complex as it was never actually a CPU. So admins often identify this as the CPU. but rather it was a complex calculation based on the number of cores and so onward. Often the definition in your contract may also be outdated and not suited for a modern virtualized environment, for example. So be careful with all these items. Make sure that you always base yourself on the definition, the long text in your contract, and not base yourself on whatever the technical team says is the normal interpretation of what a core, a CPU, and so onwards is. So these are just a few examples, but as mentioned, there is hundreds. Let's go on to the next slide and then dig a little bit into indirect access. Now, we're not going to cover this too much. It seems that there are not too many people who are focusing on that right now, but still, I think it's right now very important, especially with the AAP program. So how do you tackle indirect access? So if you've got your engines, you've got your users, you still want to make sure, is there anything that cannot be measured easily that is behind everything, indirectly accessing, that also needs a license? So the straightforward, the process that we have for that is one, always know your contract. Step 0 shouldn't even be mentioned in any SAP license review. Then the first real step there is then check your SAP interfaces. So everywhere you've got a third-party program or anything that's coming in, which is not SAP to SAP, see what is going on. So first, make sure that you've got a list of all of these. The second step is, once you've got a list, is check for every one of them, what is the risk of anything going on there. And also, by the way, if you do not have a clear view of all your external systems coming in, third-party applications, it could also be worthwhile to just see what external users, for example, customers, suppliers, consultants, and so on, that have access to some of these systems, or just people in your company that do not have an SAP account, like factory workers. Define the risk for each interface and then check for exceptions or actions to see how do you want to resolve it. One solution is you buy the document licenses, but we would always recommend this as the last potential solution. The first step is see, can you maybe find another way which is cheaper? But it is a valid option, obviously, if there is no other solution. So going on to the next slide, what do we see as indirect access risk for an interface? So it's not never going to be guaranteed. Usually, if we see at least 2 or 3 of these, we would say it's a high risk. If you see only one of them, it could be okay, or it's usually okay. So first of all, writing to SAP by any third-party application, bigger risk. The very high number of user, big risk, because you're looking at a lot of potential indirect access users that need a license. Third one is external users, because usually all your internal people will have a license through one or the other system, while external people like suppliers, customers, and so onwards do not have any license, so bigger risk. Fourth is real-time access versus batch jobs. If there is direct back and forth between SAP and your system, is going to have a higher chance to be counted as indirect access. And the last one is extensive SAP interaction versus limited. If there's only a little bit of interaction, usually it's fine. If it's like, for example, a user time that would write back once every year, you're probably fine. If there's continuous activity through the year, you might want to have very close retention. So yeah, this is very briefly on that indirect access. So map it out, get the risks, and once you've got everything risked out for all the highest risks, find a solution to see what are you going to do about it. Do you want to take action, yes or no? Do you want to buy licenses? Ideally, no. Sometimes there's no other option. So let's go outwards, because I believe so. Sam, you can obviously help in that indirect access review as well. If you struggle to get your interfaces correctly mapped out, they can help you identify it, but will be limited to whatever the SAP system could see, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So next slide. So yeah, here we have an example of indirect access data. So for example, if you want to use a tool, that's what we call a ground up analysis. So we start by analyzing technical connections, and you can see the report will give you transactional volume. It will differentiate between transaction type and therefore you can identify at-risk interfaces and connections. You can then map them upstream of the interface to the corresponding third-party application, and that's a very quick and fast way of identifying risk. Otherwise, if you're not using a tool, you have to do an enterprise-wide architecture review. So you've got to start from the top down and look at your enterprise architecture, look at all third-party systems connected to SAP, and then you have to review what functionality the interface is triggering in the SAP software, and how users are using the application, and does use of that third-party application constitute indirect use of SAP by way of the interface. So that's the kind of report you get from SAMcube, telling you where to look and where your risk resides. On the left, you have a digital document analysis. So independently of SAP's passport, you could determine the number of chargeable digital documents that you're consuming. And specifically, if you find indirect access risk, digital access can in many cases be a cheaper way of remediating existing risk. If you're not at risk, then you would merely choose digital document licensing if you expected that it might be cheaper in the future, given what you plan to do with SAP. If you're innovating and you've got projects and you're automating processes, then that might be cheaper in the future. But certainly if you're at risk, you would want to evaluate if user and package licensing, i.e. legacy, indirect access licensing model, is cheaper to mitigate risk, or if you'd be more cost effective doing it via digital document. So consolidating and drawing conclusions. The whole point is to produce an enterprise effective licensing position. So the kind of licensing attributes that you want to try and capture would be material number, license description, metric, product type, units per block, number of blocks licensed, the total license level, the net license fee paid for each product, the list price and the discount that you have achieved. Is the product SAV or non-SAV relevant? And what is the maintenance fee associated with that product? Also documented at the order level. So if you can see to the right-hand side, you can see the order history. In fact, for each of those orders, you should be not just documenting the quantity on each order form, but for each order form, we should be able to drill down and document separately blocks licensed, license level, net license fee, list price, and discount. And then on the left part of the diagram on your screen, and more to the middle, where you have the black boxes highlighted, that is your usage information. So what we do when we get the usage information, you need to take a product measure. Now, for example, if that's revenue, it could be down to the pound. It could be 6,525,424,332 pounds. That would be consuming a certain number of blocks of entitlement. So you take the product measure as it is, but then you have to translate that into blocks consumed. So if you've, revenue is 5.5 billion and it's licensed on blocks of 100 million, you have to calculate how many blocks you're consuming. You then look at block variance. So what's the variance in consumed blocks versus the number of entitlement blocks that you've measured? So if you need 100 and you've only licensed 85, you're 15 short, and that will give you the ability, you can apply pricing information that you've actually aggregated through the history of the contract, and you actually know what your licensing risk is for that product based on the shortage. Once you've applied pricing information, the last two attributes there is consumption value. So that's the cost of the number of blocks you're consuming, and the consumption variance, that's the value of the licensing entitlements you should have, i.e. the 100 blocks, versus how much you spent on the 85 blocks that you have actually licensed. And do be mindful when you're quantifying audit risk, you should quantify it according to the discount and pricing levels in your contract. But if non-compliant use is discovered as a result of an audit, SAP actually have the right to revoke discount and charge you full list price. So for example, if you're getting 66% discount, licenses charged at full list price would be 3 times more expensive. That means if you're on a runtime basis, you would be paying 3 times as much for the respective runtime license fee for those licenses, and then you'd also be paying 3 times as much for the respective support and maintenance that would be associated with those licenses as well. So when you're quantifying audit risk, you should be aware of that, but primarily quantifying risk in accordance with your contracts. When you have an ELP, we'll just look back. You can see actually the ELP on the right is segmented into 4 primary blocks of different types of licenses. So what we've actually done is we've segmented products into in use and not in use. And we want to further segment in use products. So that's products that are being used. Are they compliant, i.e. right licensed, under licensed, over licensed, and to what extent? So what's the variance that we have? And we're going to calculate the variance at a product level and then the net variance across the estate. So if you're under licensed on a third, right licensed on a third, and over licensed by a third, what's the net effect?
Run out of time, so I don't know if we're going to be able to cover all of this. I don't know if we want to just skip to some questions and just take it 5 minutes, 10 minutes longer, or
yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. We still have 95% of attendees online, so we'll carry on for a few more minutes until people start dropping off. But yeah, so in use and not in use products, be aware, if something's not in use, you have to be aware of, was it ever used, never used? Is it a future product? Is it held in stock for capacity? Is it out of support? Doing that will give you insights into how you can deal with that product and perhaps return value from that product, or indeed reduce your cost base and what you would need to do to achieve that reduction. So going back to that is in effect the end of the presentation. So Hans, maybe you want to take the first 2 and talk about cost saving and audit risk, and I'll take a look at the questions that have come in.
Sure. I think maybe we could also just tackle some of these questions during the stream and see if any of them reference these items.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, the question. Yeah.
Yep.
So just the question I've just answered, because it's just on top of my mind, is someone asked, how do companies account for external parties accessing their system? Example system, a supplier portal. So as this is new thing is discovered by digital access. So this is why you would do that 3rd step and do your review of digital access. Now keep in mind that traditionally many contracts did get exceptions. You might have a limited user type that is specifically for partners or things like that. So it could be that your contract already has an exception user type that is specifically for that purpose. If you do not have it under the traditional structure, you would always need to cover everyone, all your suppliers, all the use of your suppliers with a license. Now you can also cover that with the document license type if it's cheaper. So I hope that answers that. So let's take another one. The next one we haven't answered, Jan, is how can we manually extract the list of interfaces for indirect access review? Can you specify any standard T code or report or table? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. It's all possible, because any data being analyzed by a tool can be analyzed manually by accessing the relevant data tables. So for interfaces, what you want to look at is you want to start looking at mapping the technical connections. So you might have a number of different interface sources that can be things like SOAP, REST, IDOC, communication, service, technical user. There's many different ways of bringing data into an SAP system via a third-party application. So the first thing is you have to identify with your technical teams all the different types of interface connection that you have. Normally, every business, as soon as they establish a technical connection where data has been transferred from one system to another, will add that to what's commonly known as an interface catalog. So quite typically, that would be basis technicians or architects. So you should speak to your technical teams or technicians as to how you can start mapping technical connections and interfaces to and from SAP. And again, that when you're doing a manual assessment, that gives you a starting point. Now, when you're looking at technical connections, for example, if you're looking at sales orders coming in through a particular technical connection, then you need to look in your CRM system. And if you actually look at the sales and service order measurement documentation on the SAP support portal, it actually tells you, and it lists the different types of sales and service order, and it tells you which data table they reside within, and you could theoretically do a data table extract and extract that data manually. But the first place is to start by making a list of all the technical connections, and typically they would already be documented by architects and basis technicians. So that would be the first place to start.
Yeah, and then I think the next question, and actually the one beyond that as well, is one says, how can we differentiate GRC with license management? And the next one is SD03 used for users measurements? And I think I can answer both of them the same. And I would always say any of these tools, be very careful to rely on the results. When it comes down to it, SAP will only trust what comes out of their law report as valid. I know SAMQ, for example, would give the same results, so in that case, you're fine. But with tools like SD03, GRC, while they can help you with management, they are not an alternative to user measurements. So while you can, they're good tools, good for management and so on, do not trust them when it comes to that. If it's not the same in the system, and I've seen too many cases where people have central user administration and they say, oh, we assigned all the users there, but then you look in the system and you see there's thousands of professional users assigned that they were not aware of, that are old users and so onward. And if these are still in the internal system, it will not be recognized. So only rely on the right measurement tools, be it log, be it SAMQ, that actually dig into the system far enough so to make sure that you don't have any surprises when you share these reports with SAP.
Yeah. Next one was, how can we identify the licenses pertaining to the connectors and adapters? Can law identify these, and can you throw some insights on a manual review? Okay, well, first of all, you have to understand that a package is required for the functionality. And one I alluded to there, for example, sales orders, it's in CRM system that the sales and service order functionality, the sales and service order module allows you to integrate and bring externally created orders in a certain format and import them into SAP CRM. And the engine for using that functionality is called the sales and service order execution engine. So therefore, you have to have some understanding of the engine licensing models and the price list and the product metrics to be able to say, okay, so there's use of SAP indirectly, and here's the appropriate package for licensing that usage. If you're talking about user licenses, you do need to read the price list. First thing you would do is read your own contract and understand which of the license types in your contract pertains to or matches to a user who's using a third-party system. So if you find there is a user who's using SAP indirectly, you have to identify what it is they're doing, and then as you would classify any dialogue user in SAP, you would have to identify the right user license type. And to answer the question, can LAW identify these? LAW can't. It only gives SAP indicative data suggesting indirect use that might need to be investigated further. But indirect users need to be licensed the same as direct users. On the price list, if you don't have indirect access specific licenses in your contract, read the price list. There are 20 to 30 different license types, and there are 5 that are maybe indirect access specific, like in some cases, business partner user, community user. In some cases, an employee user would satisfy users of a third-party system doing time and time entry, time and attendance entry, for example. That's in the employee use rights. So direct and indirect users need to be licensed the same, and it is the same contractual principles that you would need to follow. And what else do we have? Have you spotted any other questions?
The answer is, of course, yes. The recording will be shared afterwards, so don't worry if you didn't catch everything. Then can we leverage the cloud-based licensing, example Cloud Analytics, which is coming from public cloud? Now, I'm not familiar with this specific tool, so I can't really answer. I don't know what context it is. In general, cloud is somewhat easier to measure, I would say, because there's usually more built-in solutions. It's usually somewhat more regulated, but to be careful, always check your contract to see how the cloud tool is licensed. And I would say do be careful with any analytics tools to rely on them. Like I said, in the end, the same with these other tools, SAP will only rely on their own methods, their own systems. So if it's not looking the same in there, it's not going to be accepted by SAP. But unless if Jan is familiar with cloud analytics, that's about everything I can say, unfortunately.
No, I think that's a fair answer, I have to be honest. SAP has also come up with estimation notes and passport advantage tools to measure digital access. How accurate are they? Well, it is known that passport has issues when it comes to identifying or differentiating being chargeable and non-chargeable documents and subsequent documents. And of course, those that were in fact created in the SAP system and not imported from external sources. If you engage with SAP and you discuss the passport tool, you should be very thorough in getting them to declare upfront what it can and can't do, what its shortcomings are. Because if for example, it is evident that there are elements of digital document license counting that passport isn't capable of, then the estimation becomes negotiable. If it's an estimation, it's not known to be 100% accurate. You can then estimate, you can then negotiate with SAP on what the count actually might be. There are ways of getting the readout from these tools and then looking at documents to say, well, in actual fact, let's look at a high volume of sales orders. We don't believe that 100% of those were created externally. And in fact, you discover that only 60% of those measured documents are chargeable in accordance with the model. You'd then again be able to further challenge the estimation and be able to reduce the chargeable digital document count. How you go about doing that, I have to be honest, it is difficult because you have to understand, first of all, the contractual definition of each of the 9 different document types. Each of the 9 types has maybe 4 subtypes, like sales order line item, sales contract line item, and so on and so forth. And then you have to be able to, when you get the count, you have to be able to understand your enterprise architecture, and you have to understand how you can derive the source of these documents, because without that data, how can you challenge whether it was externally created or not? It is difficult. It's not impossible, but you know, if you have to give yourself time to do it. You have to get the data first, and you have to spend the time understanding the commercials and understanding the technical environments as well. And it's a laborious process if you're not using a software product to automate that, obviously, but it's not impossible. Next one there.
The last one is already answered in that answer, I think. Differentiate between internal and external. It doesn't really. It's just, you know, maybe there's some estimates, but it can't actually do that because it would be impossible to know for any system if data coming from internal and external. Also keep in mind with these tools, estimation node, passport advantage tools, that they can never detect users. So it might, if you, for example, have one user creating 1,000 documents, you still want to prefer licensing that user, not the 1,000 documents, just because it's going to be cheaper. So always keep that in mind, that SAP will use these tools to sell their digital access documents, but it's not a guarantee that you actually need them. You might already be licensed, you might have something else. Their focus is just going to try to give you a number and then hook you on that to increase your contract price.
So we've got one last question come in, I think. So what might change with Microsoft and SAP integration as far as licenses are concerned? Okay, great question. But just imagine there's integration between your Microsoft applications and SAP. The first thing that might do is broaden the number of users who are using SAP via third-party applications. So if you're performing some work on Microsoft and that ends up in SAP that's being shared and pulled back out into Microsoft Teams or other applications, then you may have an indirect access risk. We'll have to see how Microsoft and SAP actually contract the use of Microsoft applications and how they're interfaced with SAP. But that's one potential risk. Other than that, the main collaboration between Microsoft and SAP is actually on Azure, and that's simply about where you host your SAP instance, whether it's ECC6 on Azure or it's S4 HANA in the Azure cloud. So nothing over and above that, I wouldn't think. How does SAMQ measure usage? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think everyone's still waiting as well to see what they're actually planning to do, because it's just been announced, so nobody knows what their plan is. For now, I wouldn't expect much, but as Jan says, be careful with any integration until it's been clarified.
Yeah. Last question before we close it off. We are a little bit over time, but how does SAMQ measure usage across license types? Well, usage is defined by transactions executed in the system, and every user will have transaction logs. Now, a license type, a definition in the contract will say what a user can and can't do. So you can actually associate a license definition with transactional usage in the systems. So what SAMQ does is we actually translate. We have standard templates for measuring different types of user in the SAP systems. But if a customer's contract deviates from the standard definition, we can customize that by including or excluding various different transactions from the analysis. So SAMQ merely looks across all systems and users at what people are doing, so what transactions they're doing, and it correlates that to the rule sets defined for each different license type, and then it can automatically determine how that user needs to be licensed. You can, with SAMQ, you can switch between transactional usage and assigned roles and authorizations. You can pick which principle you want to license users on. So it's neither here or there. It's probably more expensive, in fact, to license via assigned roles, because users normally have roles in excess of what they actually need. But yeah, that's how SAMQ does that. Some people saying thanks, much appreciated for that, and others asking for demos. Yes, we'll reach out to you after the webinar and we can arrange such things. So again, thanks everybody for joining the webinar. It's been a great pleasure chatting to you again. Thanks to everyone who's been following previous VOQUZ Labs webinars, and thanks for signing into this one. And thanks again to Hans. It's been great working on this webinar with you, and no doubt all the audience really appreciate the insights that you have on conducting these internal licensing reviews.
Of course. It's always nice. But let's end it here then. All right.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Bye now.
Bye.